Hello everybody, and welcome to the Painting Paladin. My name's Justin, and today I'll be taking you through a step-by-step on how to paint the Voodoo Troll with a staff from my 3D Print Forge. Now you can find my 3D Print Forge on Patreon, or you can check out their previous releases on my mini factory. With that being said, let's head to our work desk and get started, shall we? Alright, now before we begin, I undercoated this model with gray Seer spray. I figured this was a good color to start building on for the rest of our colors. With that being said, the first color that we're actually going to be using is Rhinox Hide. Now the reason we're using this is we're going to start off a little bit different than we normally do. Normally we block in the big areas first and then work our way to the smaller details. However, in this case, we're actually going to start with blocking in the belt. Now the reason we're doing this is because the belt has tiny little trim that goes around the top and bottom of it, and if we block in the bigger areas first, it's going to be a headache to paint on later. So if we get it knocked out of the way now, then we won't have to deal with that later on. With the Rhinox Hide applied, the next color that we're going to be using is Leadbelcher, and this is just going to be painting the metal on the top and the bottom of the belt, as well as the studs in the middle. So just take your time and work around it, but if you get any on the upper skin area or the lower robe, that's okay because we're going to be blocking those in later. Alright, with those dry, we can move on to our first wash, and that's going to be Nuln Oil. Now we're just going to be applying this as an all-over wash all around the belt. Alright, now that the wash is dry, you can see it added a bunch of definition to the area. However, it darkened everything down, so what we're going to start doing is building everything back up. Now the first color we're going to be using for that is Rhinox Hide, but this time we're only going to apply it as thin lines in the middle of the belt areas there, in between the studs. Alright, now the next color we're going to use is Ironbreaker. Now this is just going to be to bring out the metal parts, so just take your time and work your way around the top and the bottom. As for the metal studs in the middle there, all you need to do is just add a small dab on the top of the stud just to bring the shine back out on it. Okay, with the belt all finished up and out of the way, we can start moving on to blocking in the bigger areas. Now the first area that we're going to be working on is his robes. So to do this, we're going to be using Steel Legion Drab, and just apply this all over the robes, but take your time when working around the belt that we just finished painting. Once the Steel Legion Drab is done, we're going to move on to our next color, and that's going to be Zandri Dust. Now we're just going to be applying this all over the fur that runs along the center and bottom of the robes there. Now that the Zandri Dust is dry, we can move on to our next wash, and that's going to be Agrax Earthshade. And this is also going to be applied as an all-over wash, so just work your way around the model and watch out for any pooling. But if you do get pools, use the tip of your brush to soak them up. Once again, the wash has added a bunch of definition to our model, but it darkened everything down, so we're going to go back to building it back up. Now the color we're going to use, again, is Steel Legion Drab, And this is just going to be on all the raised areas, avoiding those deep recesses where the shade is settled. So just take your time and work your way around the model. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be painting is Ushabti Bone, and this is going to be for the fur trim. However, we're going to be applying this using the dry brushing technique. Now if you're not familiar with dry brushing, it's where you dip your brush into the paint, wipe most of it off until only a little remains, and brush it on the model so that it catches only the raised areas. So just take your time and work your way around all the fur here, and try to avoid getting any on the Steel Legion Drab you just painted. Alright, now that the robe is finished, we can start blocking in the next big area, and that's going to be his skin. Now for my troll, I decided I'm going to paint him as a jungle troll from the Darkspear tribe, and they have that bluish color skin. So the first color I'm going to be using is Thousand Suns Blue as my base layer. With that base layer applied, we can move on to our next color, and that's going to be Ahriman Blue. Now we're just going to layer this all over the top of the first Thousand Suns Blue. Okay, once the Ahriman Blue is dry, we can add a wash now all over the skin. Now the color I'm going to be using is actually a 50-50 mix of Drakenhof Nightshade and Lamia Medium. Now the reason I decided to mix it like this is because Drakenhof Nightshade by itself is a very dark, deep color, and it's going to be a little bit too much for what we need. So by mixing it with the Lamia Medium, you still get the nice shading effect, but not as intense. So just apply this now as an all-over wash on all the skin. Okay, now that the shade is dry, we can start layering it up again. Now the main color that we're going to be using is Baharoth Blue. And just like before, we're only going to be painting it on the raised areas, avoiding those deep recesses where the shade is settled. Alright, now that the Baharoth Blue is dry, you can definitely see the skin really stands out. So what we're going to do next is actually tone it down just a little bit. And to do that, we're going to use that 50-50 mix of Lamia Medium and Drakenhof Nightshade. And that'll help toning down the skin as well as tying everything together. Now that the wash is dried, you can see it worked exactly as intended, bringing the color down just a little bit as well as tying everything together. So now we can start moving on to the smaller details, and the first color we're going to need for that is Thondia Brown. Now this is going to be for all the wood that's on the model, and that's his face mask and 2 shoulder pads there. Next, we're going to get the wraps on his hands, and the color that we're going to use for this is Rakarth Flesh. Now just take your time when working on this, because the wraps go almost to the end of his knuckles there, as well as the base of his thumb. Once that's dry, the next thing we're going to do is apply an all-over wash of Agrax Earthshade on both the wood as well as the wraps. Once the wash is dry, the next color that we're going to be using is Gorthor Brown. And now this is going to be applied using the dry brushing technique across all the wood, just to really bring out that wood grain texture. Alright, now that the Gorthor Brown is dry and the wood texture has been brought out, we can go about painting the skull on the mask. Now the color I chose for this was Gray Seer. Now a few things that might help you when painting this. The first is I use a reference picture when I paint freehand symbols like this, and that way I can see the placement on where everything goes. And the other thing is make sure that your paint is really thinned out and it flows really smooth, and draw your outline first. You can always go back and fill it in with the rest of your color. Alright, with that done, this model is really coming along. So now we can move on to the next step, which is going to be his hair. Now, for his hair, I wanted that iconic bright red hair that you see in a lot of the illustrations. So the color that we're putting down first is Mephiston Red. Now when applying this, just take your time and be careful not to get it on the wood, the ears, or the back of his neck, and just slowly work around the areas there. Moving on, the next color that we're going to be applying is Carroburg Crimson, and we're just going to be applying this all over the hair, making sure it settles in all those deep recesses. And lastly, now the Carroburg Crimson is dry, we can move on to the last color for this, which is going to be Evil Sunz Scarlet. Now just like before, we're going to only paint the higher areas, avoiding all those deeper recesses where the shade is settled in. Okay, so the next color that we're going to be using is actually Thousand Suns Blue again, and this is just going to be for all of his toenails and fingernails. Now that that's done, we'll be painting all the rope on the model. So the color that we're going to be using for this is Mournfang Brown. Now you'll see it just on his arms there, holding his shoulder pads in place, as well as the rope around his neck, holding that tooth. Alright, now that that's done, we can move on to our next color, which is Rakarth Flesh. And we're just going to be using this to paint his two tusks there, the tooth on his necklace, and the two little teeth, or horns rather, that are on his belt buckle there. Okay, so now that that's dry, the next color we're going to be using is Agrax Earthshade. However, we're not going to be applying it like we usually do. This time we're going to use a small fine detail brush and just paint small little triangle type stripes at the base of the teeth and tusks there, just to give it a nice like rooted effect. Alright, with that all finished up, we can start moving on to the next bit, and that's going to be his staff. Now the first color we're going to use is Kabalite Green, and this is just going to be for those carved teeth that are at the top of the staff there. Once that's dry, the next thing we're going to do is apply an all-over wash of Nuln Oil. Okay, now that that's darkened down, the next thing we're going to do is apply a dry brush of Warpstone Glow across the tips of it there. Moving on, the next color that we're going to use is Retributor Armour. Now this is just going to be for that center bit there in the staff, as well as the orbs and discs that are up and down it. Once that's applied, the next thing we're going to do is apply an all-over wash of Reikland Fleshshade on all the gold areas there. Alright, now that's dry, the next color that we're going to be using is Liberator Gold. And just like before, we're only going to be painting this on the raised areas there, avoiding those deep recesses. Alright, now that all the gold is finished up, we can start moving on to the next part, which is going to be all the feathers. Now the first color that we're going to be using is Warpstone Flesh, and this gives us a good starting point to build up all our greens on. Alright, with that base layer done, the next color that we're going to be using is Warpstone Glow, and this is just going to be layered right over the top of the previous layer there. Alright, now the next thing we're going to be doing is applying an all-over wash of Athonian Camoshade right over the top of the feathers there. Okay, with that wash dried, the next thing we're going to do is layer it back up. Now the first color we're going to use is actually a 50-50 mix of Moot Green and Warpstone Glow. And this is just going to be in all those raised areas there, avoiding the deep recesses where the shade is settled in. Okay, with that dry, the next color that we're going to be using is Moot Green, just by itself. And we're going to be applying this using the dry brushing technique. Alright, with that dry brush added, the feathers are really coming along nicely, but we're going to add one last detail to really make them pop, and that's going to be to paint a diamond-like shape towards the end of the feather tips there. Now the color we're going to be using for this is Baharoth Blue. Alright, with the feathers done, there's just one last thing to do, and that's to paint the shaft of the staff. And the color we're going to be using for this is Abaddon Black. With that all finished up, this model is done. Now there's one last thing that needs to be done though, and that's basing your model. Now if you're using him as part of a larger army, you're going to want to base him the same as the rest of your army. Or if you're using him in games such as D&D or something similar, you're going to want to base him according to your campaign setting. Alright, now that he's based, this troll is ready to take on all of Azeroth. Now there's a few things to remember when painting them. The first is I chose to paint my troll like a jungle troll from the Darkspear tribe. But if blue's not your color, you can always check out the different races of trolls, such as forest or sand trolls. Second thing is, I tend to use a lot of reference pictures when painting my miniatures, so it's something that's convenient to have on hand. And lastly, when painting your miniature, take your time to avoid any mistakes. But if you make any mistakes, you can always go back and touch it up with your previous colors. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you want to stay up to date with future videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks everyone!